ဆရာရပါပြီဆရာ
Okay.
စမဆိုစလို့ရပါပြီဆရာဟုတ်
Okay, Jesuano. Okay, so again, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Recording, got it. Okay, so welcome back to our course on language and society. Today, we will have a closer look at multilingualism and language contact in Myanmar, using more than one language in Myanmar. And as you all know, there are many languages being used in Burma. First, let's have a quick look at very sketchy history of languages that have been used in Myanmar over the past roughly 1,000 years. On the left hand here, you see the possible linguistic situation in Myanmar around the 11th century. And you see the circles here very roughly indicate where we think that some of the languages were spoken at that time. The red circle here is Burmese. So probably Burmese in the 11th century was spoken only in the Ayeyarwady plains. So Burmese hadn't spread much beyond the heartland of Burmese culture, the Ayeyarwady plains, which today is basically Anya. Then the blue circle here, Pew, we don't really know where Pew was spoken. There are some areas, actually have Pew also further up here. You do get Pew sites and inscriptions. And the Pew inscriptions have been found in this area, in the Ayeyarwady Delta area. We don't really know the extent of the Pew language area, but it was basically spoken also in the central part of what today is Myanmar. Then the black part here, Mon. Mon probably was spoken in a much bigger area than it is spoken today. So all the way from the very southern part of today's Myanmar up to the central plains, including the whole Ayeyarwady Delta and parts of Thailand as well. So Mon was pretty widespread, probably. Then we have the purple line here, which is the Karen or Karenic languages. And they also probably were spoken in a much bigger area than they are today, overlapping to a good extent with Mon-speaking areas. And then finally, the yellow part here is the Dai languages. In Myanmar, you have Shan, Khamti, and Khön, for example. In the 11th century, these languages probably were still only spoken somewhere around the Chinese border. Actually, again, we don't know, there are no inscriptions from this time, but we believe that this is the area where the Dai languages came from. Now, if you look at the 21st century, the linguistic situation of Myanmar and Thailand changed a lot. What is striking now is the red and yellow parts here are much bigger. So basically Burmese is now spoken everywhere in Myanmar, and Dai languages, especially Thai, spoken everywhere in Thailand, including Laos and Shan State. And then you have some pockets up in Kachin State, Sagaing region, and across the border in India, in Assam. On the other hand, Mon is restricted to basically Mon State of today, with some pockets in Thailand. Karen is split into two parts, eastern part in Gayin State, Gaya State, and also Bago region and Mon State. And then you have Karen spoken in the Ayeyarwady Delta. So we have a pretty much changed situation, but we still have many languages spoken in Myanmar, of course, and we have some newcomers, the Indo-European languages, the green dots here, which represent Gorkha and Rohingya. languages that came into Myanmar over the last 1,000 years, basically. Goraka, more recently, roughly 2,000 years, 200 years, sorry. And then, of course, we have Pali, English, Chinese varieties as second languages or literary languages. So you see, Myanmar in historical times has always been a multilingual society, a multilingual country, even if it wasn't really a country, unified country for most of this time. Now, just to recall, to remind you of what I've shown you before, we have this topography linked to different languages. So we have the plains with the big languages, in the case of Myanmar, basically Burmese. We have the mid-level, the high plateau where there is Shan spoken. And then we have the higher hills, the hilltops and slopes, where people speak languages like Balaung and Karenic varieties, and languages like Lahu, Hmong, and others. So this is just to remind you of what I've told you before in an earlier lecture about the setting of the languages in Myanmar. Now, if you look at language contact, multilingualism and language contact, there are some cultural and geographical correlates, things that are linked to the use of the languages. And we can basically look at two kinds of areas, two kinds of geographical situations. We have the lowlands and we have the mountains. And these behave very differently in terms of culture and in terms of languages used and language contact. The lowlands we also call spread zones. Spread zones means these are areas where a population grows and spreads over a big area. And this is what happened with the lowlands in Burma, of course. The Burmese spread from their core heartland around Chaose and Bagan, probably. They spread all over the lowlands. And then we have the residual zones. These are zones where people retreated from the lowlands maybe, or are not affected much by the lowlands culture and languages, and also politics, of course. Now, if you look at the correlates of these two zones, in the spread zones, we have central languages. That means languages that have a big center and spread out from this center. In the case of Myanmar, this was basically the court at Inwa or Mandalay area. And then this court language was spread across the biggest parts of the Awadi Plains. These languages tend to be high prestige. They're considered good language, literary languages, court language. So they're standardized to some extent. They're used as literary languages, which means they have a standard written form. And there is quite a degree of prescriptive usage of these languages. So there are people telling you how to speak and how to write the language properly. These languages basically, and well, generally also have large numbers of second language speakers. So when a language spreads in an area like Burmese did, many people who did not speak Burmese originally, or who do not speak Burmese as their native language, will also learn Burmese as a second language. The first language speakers, native speakers of these languages, generally are monolingual. They speak only Burmese. So if you speak Burmese as your native language, there is no need for you to also learn a smaller language like Gadu or Ganan or Tana or whatever. These lowland societies are usually heavily hierarchical. So there is someone on top, like a king or a general, whatever. And then there is people at the bottom who don't have much say. So they're very hierarchical. And as we've seen, these cultures and languages are basically restricted to the lowlands and the valleys, the fertile plains where you can have wet rice cultivation, you can grow vegetables and fruit, you can catch fish. And wet rice cultivation is very effective in feeding many people. So if you have paddy, if you have rice fields, you can grow rice that is enough for big populations. And this all helps for these spread zones, for these centralized kingdoms or states to survive and to spread. On the other hand, if you look at the residual zones, there you have peripheral languages, which means smaller languages that do not spread much. They're often considered low prestige, as opposed to the state language or court language. Many of these languages are only oral languages. That means they have no written form. There is often no standard of these languages. There's no one who tells you how to speak Balaung or how to speak Gadu or Tano. People just speak the way they do, naturally. Not many outsiders will learn these languages, so there are not many second language speakers, not many or no L2 speakers. On the other hand, the native speakers of these smaller languages are generally multilingual. We have seen this. If you are Balaung on a hilltop, you will speak Balaung, your Balaung variety, of course. You may also speak Shan, and you will also speak Burmese if you go to school and have interaction with administration. These societies are much less hierarchical. They are more egalitarian. And you have seen this in the pronoun systems, for example. Like, they don't have the hierarchical social pronouns. They just have, like English, I, you, he, she. These residual zones are basically the highlands and mountains, less accessible. There are no big areas to grow wet rice. So people in the hills rather grow dry rice, which is then eaten as sticky rice often. They can grow vegetables, fruit, and they can gather forest products. They can go hunting in the forest. They can collect roots and fruit from the forest. So these are the different kinds of societies that you still do have in Burma. They're being much more mixed these days. Basically, you still have the situation in Burma. So let's have a look now of what happens when speakers of these different languages are in contact. And basically, we have seen that we have many L2 speakers for the big languages and no or very few L2 second language speakers of the small languages. But still there is interaction, and these languages influence each other. So one important point here is the number of L2 speakers that you're talking about. And the other important point is the prestige of a language and its speakers. So let's look again at what happens in language contact. In the last lecture, we talked about the theory of what happens in the brain of an individual who has access to different languages or different language codes in their brain. And then they mix up their languages because they want to transmit their ideas, their thoughts as easily and clearly as possible. Now, let's have a look at societies with speakers who have access to different language codes. One author said that a language is a heterogeneous population of idiolects. Now, what does that mean? We've been talking about this in earlier lectures, that all speakers speak their own language. And the language someone speaks is always a little bit different from the language of their neighbors or even of their close kin, their family. So we all speak our idiolects. Idiolect means the variety that one individual speaks. This is always a bit different from other people's idiolects, and it always depends on the personal history of the speaker. So a language is a collection of idiolects that are never exactly the same. Now, let's take the example here. The green area, we can say, is the population of Mon speakers. The blue part is the population of Burmese speakers. IL here always means idiolect. So this is always the language of one specific speaker. Now we look at IL1, this speaker here. Let's suppose this speaker is a prominent figure in his society. Maybe he's a teacher or he's a wealthy tradesperson. So this speaker, IL1, speaks both Mon and Burmese. So in his head, he has access to both Mon and Burmese. Now, when he speaks Burmese, when he meets Burmese people, like IL3 here, who basically speaks only Burmese, is only in the Burmese group of speakers. So of course, IL1 will speak Burmese with IL3, because that's the language that they both know. That's the easiest language with which IL1 can transmit his or her thoughts. But as IL1 also has Mon in his head, his Burmese will be not really Burmese, but will have some Mon flavor to it. Maybe he has a slight Mon accent when he speaks, or he uses some Mon syntax. Now, if this person has some high prestige and he speaks with IL3 a lot, then you can see the language of IL3 becomes a bit green. That means there is some influence from Mon in the idiolect of speaker 3, just because he listens a lot to speaker 1, who may have some Mon in his language. If IL1, on the other hand, speaks with IL2, speaker 2, who speaks only Mon, he's monolingual Mon speaker. There are not many of them, but there's still some left. So when IL1 speaks with IL2, his Mon will contain some Burmese elements. And this is enough to color the language, the idiolect of IL2 towards Burmese. So his Mon is not purely Mon anymore, but becomes a bit Burmese, Burmanized. So you see, it's one speaker, especially if he has a high prestige in the society, who can influence monolingual speakers and color their language differently. And of course, the same happens with IL7, who speaks Shan and Burmese. So he will color the Burmese of his neighbors when he speaks with them a lot. They will take over his Shanisms, we can say, in their Burmese. Although speakers IL3 and IL6 are not multilingual, they only speak Burmese, but their Burmese changes a bit according to the contact with another speaker. So this is how language features in contact scenarios can spread across societies. And of course, if you can trace these changes, if you don't know speaker 1, we only know speaker 3, IL3, and we listen to his Burmese and see, but this is weird Burmese, this sounds a bit like Mon. Then we know that at some point in his history, IL3 or his community had contact with Mon. Maybe indirect, but there must be something with Mon there. And of course, the same is true for IL6. If we find Shan elements in his Burmese, this is a strong suggestion that there must have been Shan contact, at least at some point. So by just looking at idiolects or sociolects or dialects of a language, or in some case of the whole language, we can find out something about the history of the society, of the people. We can tell with who they were in contact. So I want to show you two examples of language contact in Myanmar that are, in the first case, does not really exist anymore that much, but we can still tell it from the languages, from the outcome of the language contact. So first, let's have a look at Shan. Shan is one of the important languages, of course, of Myanmar. It's one of the big minority languages. In Myanmar, I hear people speaking about ethnic languages in this context, which is a translation of Dayendazaga, I guess. Actually, also Burmese is an ethnic language, of course, because Burmese is an ethnicity as well. You're ethnic Bama. So ethnic language doesn't really make sense because all languages are ethnic in some way. So Shan is just one of the non-national languages, which we look at next week in more detail. It is still spoken in Shan State, of course, basically in smaller towns, villages on the Shan Plateau in South, North, and East Shan States, and across also in Sagaing and Kachin. The Shan are traditionally farmers and traders. They're Buddhist by religion, at least the majority of them. And Shan has been written probably since around the 15th century. There are not really certain inscriptions of old Shan or early Shan. And traditionally, Shan was written on palm leaves or mulberry paper, and paper and palm leaves don't last very long. So after 200 years, they just rot away, especially in the hot and humid climate that you also have up in Shan State. So we don't really know when Shan literary tradition set in. But what we can see from the contact, from the results of language contact, is that Shan must have been an important dominant language, not only in Shan State, but also parts of Kachin State and Sagaing region. It's not the case anymore now, but just from the language, we can say that. And I will show you examples right away. You probably know that Shan had a high status until 1948 in Shan State. So during the English colonial time, Shan was used as a, well, official language for some part of the administration in Shan State. It was very quickly replaced by Burmese, especially after 1962, when the use and special publication of Shan texts became illegal under the then military rule. Now, why do we know? What can we say about the status of Shan? Today, Shan is clearly a subordinate language. Subordinate means it has lower status, it is not dominant. That means there will be much influence from other languages in Shan. And the influence, the biggest influence in Shan comes from Burmese, of course, because as I just said, Burmese became the only official language, especially after 1962. So Burmese, as an official state language, has all the vocabulary you need for all domains of life. And in Shan, this gradually may get lost. And Shan speakers will or have become gradually more fluent also in Burmese. They use also Burmese in their everyday communication with Burmese speakers. So the Burmese influence is there in Shan, and it is big. Now, these are just a few examples here that I took from a Shan Chronicle that was written probably the first time some 100 years ago. But these chronicles have been copied again and again. As I mentioned, Shan texts are traditionally written on palm leaves or mulberry paper, and they don't last long. So every 10 years or 20 years, these texts have to be copied. And copying very often also means editing, means replacing words that people don't understand anymore, or just use words that are more common. Now, if you look at the examples here, the Shan loanwords from Burmese, what is interesting here is the loan type. You can tell from the shape of the loanword, of the Shan loanword from Burmese, how it came into the language. Was it from the written form, or was it from the spoken form? So in many cases, you can tell that something came at an earlier time or came through writing. If you look at the difference here, or the non-difference between long time and document, in Shan, they're both kya. But the first kya is from Burmese cha, which is spelled gra. So this is a phonetic rendering of the Burmese cha in Shan as kya. So this is probably a pretty recent borrowing into Shan. On the other hand, the document kya from Burmese sa. Now this sa, as we have seen earlier, goes back to cha. What is salon today in Burmese, in earlier Burmese, was cha. So the document is cha. And again, in Shan, this is rendered as kya, because the cha in Shan also turned into sa or tsa, like in Burmese. Then if you look at the rendering of the Burmese yagao, as you have in yu, yure, and a ye and yata, in Shan, you get, in one case, ya, yu, in one case you get l, like ale, and in one case you get ra, like rata, for yata. So the different rendering of the Burmese yagao in Shan shows you when and how the word was borrowed into Shan. In the case of yo, it was just phonetic. It's just the Burmese, modern Burmese pronunciation that was written in Shan letters. And this is how you spell it in Shan then. Remember that this yo in earlier Burmese was pronounced as ro, as it still is in Arakanese. Then with ale, it's a bit more difficult. Obviously, this word was borrowed at the time when Burmese a ye was still pronounced as a re, with a ra. And this ra in Shan was pronounced as l. This is still what happens in Lao and Standard Thai, that words with R, also loan words from English, new loan words from English, are pronounced with L instead of R. And the last case here, the rata, this is obviously an orthographic loan, which comes from Pali, and Shan just retained the Pali spelling here. In some cases, we get older forms of Burmese conserved in Shan, and they show that the words were borrowed at the time before sound changes happened in Burmese. So we can tell something about the time of the borrowing from Burmese into Shan. And this, of course, shows that Burmese has been an important language for many centuries in Shan state. So it's not only after 62 that Burmese took over the dominant role, but Shan has for a long time been influenced by Burmese. And you probably know the history of Burma, or the supposed history of Burma, about the Shan brothers that at some point were the rulers of Mandalay. So there has been interaction for many centuries between Shan and Burmese. Another source of influence in Shan is Standard Thai. Now, Standard Thai is closely related to Shan, and Thailand, especially northern Thailand, Chiang Mai, has been a safe refuge for Shan people, for Shan education, Shan publications, Shan politics for many decades. So it's not surprising that a lot of the terminology for official administration, politics, education in Shan is borrowed from Thai. So the word politics itself, Ganmeng in Shan, is probably a borrowing from Thai Ganmeng. The official Chaunati from Thai Chaunati, and so on. Now, it's not always easy to see that something is a Thai loanword in Shan, because they could be just cognate, because the languages are very similar. They go back to the same parent language. So in the case of Dosu and Tangte, it's not really clear they could be original Shan words. They just look like Thai words or cognate to Thai words. But still, there are some indications that these words actually are borrowed from Thai. And the borrowing is from either Northern Thai or Standard Thai. And you can tell from the shape of the words, like the Nati in Chao Nati. This is the Northern Thai Chiang Mai pronunciation, while Nati would be the Standard Thai pronunciation. And in Samakhom, from Samakhom, this is the Standard Thai pronunciation you get in Shan. Northern Thai would be Samakhom, if it existed, but also there it's borrowed from Standard Thai. So again, here we can see where the borrowing comes from, and we can see at what time, because we can figure out the history of the sound changes in Thai and Shan. And we can see here that these are all pretty recent borrowings. So Thai influence is much more recent. But I have said that Shan was a dominant language for some time, and actually for a pretty long time, probably, in this area. And this we can see from loanwords in other languages, from Shan traces in neighboring languages and languages further away. Pao, a Karenic language spoken in Shan state, it's the northernmost of the Karenic languages. Pao has a number of Shan loans. Actually, there are hundreds of Shan loans in Pao. They sometimes just look like Pao words because the sound shape, the syllables are very similar in Shan and Pao. But in all these cases, you have good cognates in the Dai language family and not in the Karenic languages. So these are certainly loanwords from Shan into Pao. And you can see this is everyday vocabulary, like a cave, love, lift up, pick up, collect, tell a story. This is everyday vocabulary that has been borrowed from Shan into Pao. And this shows there has been very close interaction. In some cases, like rak and krai, these are forms that are not like this anymore in modern Shan, but we can reconstruct to old Shan. So this shows that the contact goes back for quite a long time. A very similar case we have in Palaung. The examples here are from Shui Palaung, Samlong. And again, there are some words that belong to the basic vocabulary, like love, follow, swim, able. These are all borrowings from Shan into Palaung. And again, we get some old Shan forms conserved in Palaung that didn't make the sound change that happened in Shan, like rak is still rak in modern Shan. Now it's hak, because R became H in Shan. A few centuries ago, this must have happened. So the Palaungs borrowed this word rak before the change happened in Shan. Today, Palaung and Pa'o is not really influenced by Shan anymore. The Palaungs and Pa'os don't speak Shan anymore. They rather speak Burmese as a second language now. But we still see these words in their lexicon. Shan also left traces further away, namely in Chingpo, spoken up in Kachin state. Chingpo is the lingua franca among the Kachins. Shan loans in Kachin, or Chingpo especially, are mostly from the area of trade, religion, and administration. So probably the Shan were the leaders of the society and the Chingpo were the peasants. So we have things like market, gat from Shan gat. You have oil, naman from Shan naman. Then things like soldier, luksuk from Shan luksuk, town, mung from Shan mung, and so on. Interesting is the word for food market, because in Shan this is gat khao. Gat khao, market, rice. In Chingpo, the order is reversed, because Chingpo is a head final language, so the modifier comes before the noun. So it's rice market or food market, like in English, whereas in Shan, you would say market food, market rice. So in this case, we have matter replication, but not pattern replication, as opposed to naman, which just takes the whole Shan expression, including the word order. Another interesting example is pagoda, gongmu in Chingpo, which in Shan is gongmu. Now this gongmu in Shan is a loan from Burmese. It's from Burmese gongmu. But gongmu in Burmese is not pagoda, it's merit. It's offering to a temple, it's a good deed, something good that you do. In Shan, gongmu always means pagoda. It's not used for merit, only for pagoda. And this is the meaning that has been taken over by Chingpo. So this makes it very likely that this gongmu is really a loan from Shan and not directly from Burmese. So this shows that Shan was much more widespread, and it shows us something about the role of Shan in Chingpo society. Now let's go on to the second example, Mon in Burmese. As you probably know, Mon is a language of the lowlands, and it's the language of former kingdom of Lower Burma and Central Thailand, Dwarawati and the Tho kingdoms, probably same thing. The Mons are traditionally farmers and traders. Mon used to be spoken in a wide area across Burma and Thailand. They're Buddhist, and Mon is one of the oldest literary languages of Southeast Asia. The earliest inscriptions go back to the 6th century. So Mon, of course, one of the most important languages of Southeast Asia. We have seen in earlier lectures that Mon was the or one of the literary languages of Bagan. Bagan was a Burmese kingdom, was not a Mon kingdom, but Mon was the language written at Bagan. And Mon, especially Old Mon, left its traces in Burmese in the form of vocabulary, and it's basically the high vocabulary. It's not everyday things, but it's the literary language, court language. So you have things like Old Mon Gindo or Gindok, which became Burmese Gado, which is a formal way of begging pardon. It's still spelled as Gando, which shows or reflects the Old Mon spelling Gando or Gindo. An interesting word is the Burmese buzo, buzo to worship, which comes from Pali, puja. Now, puja in Burmese should become puza, not buzo. Why do you have this za here? Why not puza? Well, the reason is simple, because Old Burmese took it from Old Mon, and in Old Mon it's pujao. Old Mon had the rule that all verbs and nouns must end in a consonant. No open syllables in verbs and nouns. So even the Pali puja, which is borrowed into Old Mon, could not end in the a. So the Mon added the wa, just to make it comply with the rules that you need a consonant there. Now this pujao, spelled like this in Old Mon, was taken over in this form into Old Burmese, and this developed later into buzo. So here we can see that this Pali word came into Burmese via Mon. There are many, many other Pali words that just by their form in Burmese show they were borrowed via Mon, not directly from Pali. There are some grammatical morphemes, grammatical words that are similar in Old Mon or Modern Mon and Burmese. Same function, same form. In many cases, we don't know whether the borrowing was from Burmese into Mon or Mon into Burmese. But in any case, this shows that there has been very intimate interaction between Mon and Burmese for at least 1,000 years. Since they first came into contact in Bagan, Mon and Burmese have been very close. Mon and Burmese still are in contact today, especially in Mon and Kayin state. And this does not go without leaving traces in Burmese. Now, if you have a look at the contact scenario of Mon and Burmese in Mon and Kayin states, of course, now the overall dominant language is Burmese. Everyone has to speak Burmese at school for administration. That means all the Mons do speak Burmese. The Burmese living in Mon Kayin state don't speak Mon, mostly at least. Some of them do, but most do not. So there is influence, of course. There are many Burmese loan words in Mon on all levels. If you listen to Mon, if you read Mon these days, it feels like at least half of the vocabulary is Burmese. On the other hand, there is no new Mon borrowings in Burmese. It's only borrowings from Bagan time that are still in the language, but Burmese does not take new Mon borrowings. So this is sort of expected because Burmese is the high prestige language, Mon low prestige, so Burmese will influence Mon, Mon will take Burmese loanwords. But there is syntactic influence of Mon in local Burmese. And this is sort of unexpected because, well, Burmese is dominant. So Burmese should influence Mon, not the other way around. But if you listen to southern Burmese speakers, monolingual speakers, not Mon speaking Burmese, but Burmese living in that area. If in standard Burmese, you say, the southern Burmese use things like, Biomatapu. So it's not Biotapu, but Biomatapu. The negation comes between Bio and Ta, making the Matapu sort of an element of its own, independent. Now, this is a direct translation from Mon, Waham Hulepu. So this Hulep or Hulepu corresponds to the Burmese Matapu. And this is what happens in bilingual speakers. They want to have one-to-one possibility of translating one language into the other. Don't forget, you have both systems in your head. You have access to both systems. And they just want to speak with as little effort and energy as possible. So this comes automatically if someone speaks Mon and Burmese. And remember the graphic of the idiolects, when there are many Mon speakers doing this in their, well, Mon mixed Burmese, then the monolingual Burmese speakers will take over these forms. So this can spread to non-Mon speakers, to only Burmese speakers. A similar example, if in Mandalay you would say, Dugo Byosia Malogu, you don't have to tell him. In Southern Burmese, in Mon state, they say things like Dugo Mabyo Tibu or Dugo. Yeah, Dugo Mabyo Tibu is the normal way of saying this. So this T, if you say this, Dugo Mabyo Tibu in Mandalay, people may not understand you. T means to touch, come into contact with something. Now again, this is a direct translation of Mon Hutai. And this means not touch, but also must not have to. So again, this use of tide to become have to is based on a Mon model, pattern replication. And again, if Mon Burmese bilingual speakers use this expression a lot, this will go into the heads of the monolingual Burmese speakers. They will take over this way of saying it. And then this just becomes the normal way of speaking in southern Burma, at least. Now, of course, if speaker from Molomyai move to Yangon and they say, Dugo, Mabyo Tibu, people in Yangon will not understand them. So they change their habits and will say things like Dugo Byosi Malogu. So then this influence can be reversed in the right context. And another famous example, if the mother allows her son to go to the market, in Anya, you would say, Amedabu Zedwa Kaine. Zedwa Kaine, at least for many speakers I've talked to, can mean allowed to go or ordered to go. It can be permission or it can be an order. In colloquial Burmese, now many people say this is not good Burmese. This is substandard, only Mons do that. Amedabu Zedwa. So I've heard many people who said, this is wrong, you cannot say this. But then they turn around and say, Dugo Huma Beitime. Let him sit over there. So they use it without knowing it. Probably this construction originates in southern Burma, because this is how people speak in Mon state and in Mon. Give means allow, let. Can be used in the sense of let. So this ga is just the same as be. Again, bilingual speakers want one-to-one translation possibilities. So they take over the Mon construction They use it a lot. Monolingual Burmese speakers hear it a lot. They get used to it, and then they use it as well. So in Yangon, you do hear things like this. And then there will be a difference between this and the first sentence. Dua keine, for these speakers, only means order to go, command to go. And bedwade means allow to go. There is a new distinction that came into at least some varieties of Burmese. Distinction is not there in either original Burmese or original Mon. It's only there in the mixed variety. So this is the Mon influence that we get. How and why could Mon influence Burmese there? Well, the contact scenario, just to sum up this, Burmese is culturally and politically dominant. So Mon speak Burmese as L2. And they may not be perfect in their Burmese as L2. They will have some Monisms in their Burmese. Burmese is high prestige. That means Burmese does not take any new Mon loans. Burmese takes loans now from English, mostly because English is seen as as high prestige, but Burmese does not take loans from Shan or Mon anymore. But the Mon are numerically dominant in the area, or used to be, and they speak bad Burmese, not perfect Burmese. That means their features, their second language Burmese Mon-like features will spread into the language of the local Burmese, monolingual Burmese. So we can say that matter replication, vocabulary, basically always goes from high language to low language, high prestige to low. So only from Burmese to Mon, not from Mon to Burmese, because this is more conscious, you know when it's a loan word. But the sentence structure, pattern replication, this can also go from Mon speakers to Burmese speakers. So there is a lot of Burmese influence in Mon syntax as well, but also influence of Mon syntax in Burmese. And this depends on the proficiency of these Mon speakers in Burmese and their status in society, their prestige in society. So this is a situation today, which leads to this Mon-colored Burmese. And don't forget, 1,000 years ago, the situation was reverse. 1,000 years ago, Mon was culturally and politically dominant, and Burmese was the low language, was the peasants. So the status can change. But what is important, we can still see the outcome of this contact, of the history, in the languages today. And we can see how pattern replication, like syntax, can go both ways, from high prestige, H for high, L for low, high prestige to low prestige, and from low prestige to high prestige language. And this depends basically on social factors. It depends on the number and prestige of the speakers, especially of the L2 speakers. The outcome, what we see, the results of this pattern replication contact, tells us something about the intensity of contact. This only happens when there is intensive interchange between the two groups of speakers. Pattern replication, pattern borrowing is usually not conscious. You don't know when you do Mon syntax in Burmese. It just happens. That means it's not stigmatized, so you don't try to avoid it. This is different from matter replication, loan words. They almost always go from high to low. They tell us something about the hierarchical structure of the society, which language is high prestige, which is low prestige. They can tell us something about the time of contact from the shape of the loans, like we've seen the old Shan loans in Pa'o and Palaung, which shows that the borrowing happened some 100 years ago. And they can tell us something about the kind of contact, like in the case of Jingpo, Shan loanwords in Jingpo, where we have mostly loanwords in the domains of trade, administration, and army. So pattern replication and meta replication tell us different things, different parts of the stories and of the histories of the speakers. These conclusions are possible because, as we have seen before, that language is a social cultural artifact. It's something that is shaped by the community, and it is part of the identity. Identity, in this case, is important for taking loan words only from high prestige, not from low prestige languages, for example. This also shows, of course, that status and profile of a language, like the characteristics of a language, they are not stable. That can change all the time through contact and also through language change by internal factors. But the hierarchical status and the way a language works changes all the time, or can always change. All languages, of course, are the product of their history, and they're not the final product. The history of all languages, as long as they're used, is an ongoing process, and there is always some sort of contact involved. And the contact, the result of this contact, tells us, as I said, a lot about the history of the societies, of their relations, of their community status. So language contact, the results of language contact are important not only for linguistics, but also for history in general. So this is what I want to tell you about Myanmar in terms of multilingualism. And on Monday, we will look at the last final topic of this course, the role and fate of non-national languages, again, first in general terms, and then about Burma, non-national languages of Burma, their role and histories. And again, if you have any questions now, feel free to ask. Any questions or comments? I don't see any raised hands or any turned on microphones. Okay, if there are no questions at the moment, feel free to write me emails for more information. And I hope you can enjoy the weekend with a lot of reading, and be careful if you go out. Stay safe, all of you. See you next week. Have a good weekend. ကျေးဇူးပါနော်
ဟုတ်ကဲ့ပါဆရာကျေးဇူးတင်ပါတယ်ဆရာ
See you. Bye bye.